They told me some people change your life without touching you, but I never believed in things I couldn't measure until the night Olivia Harper walked into my world and made silence feel like a decision I could no longer control. My name is Mason Grayson, and control has always been the only language I trusted, built from years of watching people break the moment pressure touched them. That evening in downtown Chicago, the air outside the Blackridge Hotel carried the usual rhythm of a city that never asks permission to move forward, yet everything inside that lobby felt paused, like time itself was waiting for someone to make the wrong move. I stood near the upper level overlooking the entrance, where glass walls reflected everything and revealed nothing, and I saw her the moment she crossed the threshold. Olivia Harper did not enter like someone trying to belong. She entered like someone who simply existed, unaware that the room had already adjusted around her presence. She held a paper cup of coffee in her hands. Nothing special, nothing that should have mattered, but the way she moved through the space made even distance feel intentional. Below me, conversations continued in quiet codes and careful glances, the kind of language people use when they are afraid of being understood, yet I stopped listening the second I noticed she had stepped into a line of sight she should have avoided entirely. A private exchange had just ended moments before her arrival, a meeting that was never meant to be witnessed or remembered, and yet she had been close enough to see fragments of it without realizing what she was seeing. Most people forget what they do not understand, but she did not forget. I saw it in the smallest hesitation when she turned her head too quickly, in the way her steps slowed near the exit as if something inside her was recalculating distance. I could have ended the situation with a single instruction, clean and absolute, the kind of decision I had made countless times without hesitation. Instead, I found myself doing something I rarely allowed myself to do. I observed, not as a strategist, not as a protector of order, but as a man trying to understand why a stranger had disrupted the structure of my attention. I signaled my team with a subtle movement, not to act against her, but to hold position, to let her continue walking as if nothing had changed. And yet everything had changed. She stepped into the night air outside the hotel, unaware that her life had already been marked by something she could not see, something that did not require contact to exist. I followed at a distance, not because I needed confirmation, but because I needed understanding. She walked through the city like it still belonged to her, crossing streets in steady rhythm, pausing at intersections with patience that felt misplaced in a world that rarely waits for anyone. At one point, she stopped beneath a streetlight and adjusted her coat against the wind, a simple gesture that somehow felt louder than any command I had ever issued. I told myself this was nothing, a passing anomaly in a life built on precision, but the truth was harder to ignore. The more I watched her, the less the world responded to me the way it always had. It was as if her existence created a second gravity, one I could not measure or dismiss. I had built my life on distance, on the belief that power was strongest when untouched, yet every step she took pulled me closer to a question I had never allowed myself to ask. What happens when control stops working not because it is challenged, but because it is no longer enough? And for the first time in years, I understood that silence was no longer something I commanded, but something I was beginning to lose. I left the street without looking back, yet the image of that building stayed with me longer than any location I had ever mapped in my mind. And by the time my car merged into the quiet late-night traffic of Chicago, I already understood that this situation had stopped behaving like a simple observation. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always believed that information is something you control by containing it. But Olivia Harper was beginning to exist in a way that did not respect containment. When I returned to my secured residence overlooking the river, the city lights below me felt the same as always, precise and distant, yet my attention refused to settle into its usual order. I reviewed what my team had gathered in silence, short fragments of data that should have meant nothing more than routine verification, an address, a basic employment record, a predictable daily pattern, but each detail now felt like it belonged to something larger than it should have been. She worked at a small design supply store on the west side of the city, nothing connected to influence, nothing tied to power, nothing that would normally ever intersect with my world, and yet she had already done exactly that without intention or warning. I found myself pausing longer than necessary on the simplest facts, not because they were complex, but because they contradicted the way I normally categorized people. Olivia Harper did not fit into risk, asset, or liability. She simply existed, and that should have been irrelevant, but it was not. The next morning arrived with the same controlled structure as every day I had lived before her appearance, yet I changed one instruction without telling anyone why. I requested continuous, passive observation. No interference. No correction. Only awareness. My assistant hesitated before acknowledging the order, which in itself was unusual, because hesitation is something people only show when they recognize deviation from expected authority. I did not explain. Explanations create weaknesses in systems that depend on precision. By midday, reports began to arrive in steady intervals. She had left her apartment at 7:43 in the morning, walked 6 blocks to a bus stop, and arrived at her workplace exactly on time. No irregularities. No deviation. No indication that she was aware of anything beyond her immediate environment. Yet each report carried a detail that I could not ignore, not because it was significant on its own, but because it remained consistent in a way that felt deliberate. She always paused before crossing streets, not out of fear, but out of awareness. She always acknowledged people who did not acknowledge her. She always moved as if the world mattered equally in every direction. I found myself replaying those patterns in my mind between meetings that required absolute attention, and for the first time in years, I noticed my focus splitting without permission. Later that evening, when I stood in the glass office overlooking the city again, I gave a single instruction that changed nothing externally, but altered everything internally. Continue observation, but increase proximity by 1 degree. Not enough to be noticed, not enough to be felt, just enough to confirm what I was already beginning to suspect, that she was not moving through my world at all. My world was starting to move around her. I did not realize how quickly silence could become something I was no longer in control of until the days began to blur into a pattern that felt less like observation and more like immersion, as if the distance I once relied on was slowly dissolving without any visible break. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always believed that clarity comes from separation. Yet Olivia Harper continued to exist in my awareness with a consistency that did not weaken over time. Each report my team delivered confirmed the same routine, the same timing, the same quiet movement through Chicago streets that should have made her predictable. But predictability no longer felt like the correct word to describe what I was experiencing. It felt instead like repetition that carried weight, as if every repeated action was building something I could not yet define. I reviewed the updated surveillance summaries late that night in my office overlooking the river, the city below moving in its usual indifferent rhythm, yet my focus remained fixed on details that should have remained irrelevant. She left her apartment at the same time, walked the same route, boarded the same bus, and sat in the same position near the window, but what unsettled me was not the actions themselves, it was the absence of variation, as if she had already decided what consistency meant in a world that rarely allowed it. I found myself asking questions that did not belong in operational thinking. Not what she was doing, but why she did it with such quiet certainty, as if her life was not shaped by external pressure, but by an internal structure I could not access. I increased observation again, not out of necessity, but out of something closer to compulsion that I had not yet named. I instructed my team to widen the coverage radius by 50 feet along her daily route, to capture environmental context rather than direct focus, because I told myself I needed a broader picture. In reality, I was searching for anything that would restore distance between her and the thoughts that were beginning to interrupt mine. The data returned nothing unusual. No deviations, no anomalies, no external interference. Everything remained stable, which should have been the end of it, but instead it created a deeper tension I could not resolve. Stability, when absolute, begins to feel unnatural when it is observed too closely. That was the thought I did not expect to have. By the 3rd consecutive day of extended monitoring, I noticed something subtle that did not appear in any report. It was not in her behavior, but in the consistency of my attention toward her behavior. I began checking timestamps earlier than necessary, reviewing footage longer than required, and requesting updates before they were scheduled to arrive. These were small actions individually, but together they formed a pattern that contradicted every principle I had used to define control. Control was supposed to mean direction, not reaction. Yet I was reacting. That realization did not arrive with emotion, but with precision, and precision is often more disruptive than feeling. That evening, I stood in front of the glass wall of my office as the city lights reflected across the surface, and I understood something I had not been willing to acknowledge. The system I had built to observe her was no longer the system containing her. It was the system beginning to contain me. And for the first time, I questioned whether silence had ever truly been something I commanded, or if it had simply been something I had never been forced to listen to until now. The night I realized I could no longer separate observation from awareness, I stayed longer in my office than I intended, not because there was work left to complete, but because leaving felt like abandoning a process that had already begun to reshape itself without my permission. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always believed that clarity comes from distance, yet distance was no longer producing clarity in anything I was reviewing. The reports on Olivia Harper continued with absolute consistency, unchanged in timing, unchanged in movement, unchanged in the structure of her daily life. And yet every new update carried a subtle shift that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with me. She still left her apartment at 7:43 in the morning, still walked the same blocks through downtown Chicago, still boarded the same bus and sat near the same window, still arrived at work without deviation, and still returned home with the same quiet rhythm that should have made her disappear into statistical irrelevance. But instead of fading, she remained present in my attention in a way that resisted categorization. I found myself reviewing footage that had already been confirmed as unchanged, not because I expected new information, but because I could not fully disengage from the act of looking. That distinction became more significant than any data point I had ever analyzed. I instructed my team to maintain the current level of surveillance, no escalation, no interference, no deviation from passive observation. Yet even as I issued those instructions, I was aware that the purpose of observation was beginning to shift. It was no longer about verifying her. It was about sustaining a connection to something I had not yet defined. I spent the next morning moving through meetings that required precision and authority, yet I noticed gaps in my attention that had never existed before. My focus would drift without intention, returning to timestamps and route confirmations that had no operational value, only continuity. By midday, I realized I was anticipating updates before they arrived, not out of necessity, but out of expectation, as if the absence of new information itself had become something I was waiting to interpret. That realization should have been enough to correct the behavior, but instead it deepened it. I expanded the observation parameters again, this time not outward, but inward, requesting a full reconstruction of my own engagement patterns over the last 72 hours. The results were immediate and precise. My review frequency had increased. My response time to reports had shortened. My requests for updates had shifted from scheduled intervals to irregular intervals. None of this indicated external pressure. It indicated internal deviation. I dismissed the analysis without comment, yet the dismissal did not restore balance. It only confirmed that I was now aware of something I could not easily reverse. That evening, I stood in front of the glass wall of my office once again, watching Chicago dissolve into layers of light and shadow, and I attempted to return to the perspective I had always trusted. Distance, structure, control. But for the first time, those concepts did not feel like anchors. They felt like measurements of something that was already changing shape. Olivia Harper had not altered her routine. She had not interfered with my systems. She had not made contact or initiated change in any measurable way. And yet my world was no longer responding to its own rules with consistency. I remained there longer than necessary, not because I was searching for answers, but because I was beginning to understand that the question itself had shifted. It was no longer about what she was doing. It was about what my attention had become while watching her. I began to understand that control is not lost in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small permissions we never consciously grant, and by the time I recognized this pattern, it had already taken shape inside my routine without my approval. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have spent most of my life believing that observation is a one-way process, that to watch is to remain untouched, but Olivia Harper had already disproved that assumption without ever interacting with me directly. Her life continued in its unchanged rhythm across Chicago, consistent in every recorded detail, from the precise moment she left her apartment at 7:43 in the morning to the exact sequence of her return in the evening, yet my awareness of those details had begun to operate outside of intention. I no longer waited for reports. I anticipated them. I no longer reviewed them once. I reviewed them twice, not because I missed information, but because the first review no longer felt complete. I told myself this was discipline, a deeper level of verification, but discipline does not require repetition without necessity, and I was beginning to repeat without necessity. That realization did not arrive as emotion, but as structural imbalance, something subtle enough to ignore yet persistent enough to remain. I attempted to correct it by narrowing my focus to operational priorities unrelated to her, expanding my workload, increasing external engagements, restoring distance through activity, but every return to silence brought the same point of reference back into focus without effort. Olivia Harper remained unchanged in every measurable way, yet her consistency had become a fixed point inside my attention, something I could not fully dislodge. I instructed my team to continue passive surveillance at the current level, no adjustments, no escalation, no deviation, yet even as I issued that instruction, I became aware that I was no longer evaluating necessity. I was maintaining proximity to information for reasons I had not authorized. That distinction became clearer when I noticed the timing of my own interruptions. Meetings were paused longer than required when updates arrived. Decisions were delayed by seconds that did not matter in isolation but accumulated into pattern when viewed together. I began to understand that the system I trusted was no longer operating as designed, not because it had failed, but because I had changed the way I was interacting with it. That evening, I stood in my office above the Chicago River and attempted to restore perspective through distance, but distance no longer produced separation. It only reinforced awareness. The city below moved with its usual indifferent precision, traffic lights cycling through their sequences, buildings reflecting light in predictable intervals, yet none of it aligned with the internal structure of attention I had developed over the past days. I considered removing observation entirely, but the thought itself did not feel like correction. It felt like loss. And that was the moment I understood the shift had already completed itself without permission. Nothing about Olivia Harper had altered. She remained exactly as she was from the beginning. But I was no longer the same observer, and that difference could no longer be reversed by instruction or intent. I had begun to understand that observation is never a passive act, but a quiet negotiation between what is seen and what begins to be expected, and in the days that followed I could no longer deny that expectation had started to reshape itself inside my awareness without permission or resistance. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have built my life on the belief that control is maintained through precision, yet precision had begun to lose its meaning in the absence of clarity between intention and attention. Olivia Harper continued her life across Chicago with absolute consistency, unchanged in her morning departure at 7:43, unchanged in her route through the downtown corridors, unchanged in her quiet arrival at work and her return in the evening, as if her existence followed a sequence that did not require interpretation. But the more unchanged she remained, the more unstable my engagement with that consistency became. I reviewed the surveillance summaries again in my office above the river, the city beneath me moving with its usual mechanical rhythm, yet my focus no longer aligned with any operational requirement. Each report confirmed what I already knew, yet I continued to open them, not for information, but for continuity, as if discontinuing the process would create an absence I was not prepared to acknowledge. I instructed my team to maintain passive observation without modification, and they confirmed compliance, but I noticed that my own instruction no longer felt like a directive. It felt like maintenance of something already in motion. Over time, I realized that my anticipation of updates had become faster than the updates themselves, and that gap between expectation and receipt created a tension that did not resolve with repetition. I began adjusting my schedule around nothing concrete, pausing between meetings not for interruption, but for alignment with a pattern that existed only in my awareness. That was the point where I understood the shift was no longer external. Olivia Harper had not changed her behavior, not once, not in any measurable way. But my perception of her behavior had become the variable that no longer stabilized. I attempted to restore structure by increasing my workload, expanding focus into unrelated matters, reinforcing the boundaries of attention through deliberate distraction, yet each attempt collapsed back into the same point of reference without effort. Even unrelated reports began to feel secondary, as if they were competing with a signal that required no validation to persist. That evening, I stood again before the glass overlooking Chicago, watching the river reflect fragments of light that never stayed in place long enough to be fully captured, and I realized that what I had been calling observation was no longer an external process. It had become a condition, a state of attention that no longer depended on input to remain active. I considered ending surveillance entirely, but the thought did not produce relief. It produced resistance, not from outside, but from within the structure of thought itself. And in that moment, I understood something I could no longer classify as strategic or emotional. The system had not been compromised. It had adapted, and I was no longer certain where the boundary between observer and subject had finally dissolved. I no longer measured time by hours or schedules, because time had begun to behave differently inside my awareness, stretching and compressing around the moments when I focused on a single unchanged point in an otherwise moving system. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always trusted structure to preserve clarity, yet structure itself had begun to feel secondary to something I could not fully define. Olivia Harper continued her life across Chicago in the same exact pattern that had never deviated since the first day I observed her, leaving her apartment at 7:43 in the morning, walking the same route through the city, boarding the same bus, and arriving at work with a consistency that should have made her disappear into statistical irrelevance. But instead of fading into background data, she had become the central reference point around which my attention organized itself without instruction. I reviewed her reports again in my office overlooking the river, the city below reflecting light across the water in steady, predictable motion, yet nothing outside mirrored the internal shift occurring within my own perception. Each report confirmed identical outcomes: no variation in timing, no deviation in behavior, no disruption in sequence. Yet I found myself opening them repeatedly, not because I needed confirmation, but because absence of review felt more disruptive than repetition itself. That realization marked a transition I could no longer ignore. I had begun maintaining observation not as an action, but as a condition, something that continued even when I was not actively engaging with it. My team continued passive monitoring under strict instruction, reporting at fixed intervals, yet I noticed that I no longer waited for those intervals to arrive. I anticipated them, and anticipation had replaced response entirely. That shift created a subtle imbalance in how I processed all unrelated information, as if every external input now passed through a system that had already been altered by a single persistent reference point. I attempted to restore separation by increasing engagement in unrelated operations, extending focus into areas that once held full priority, but each attempt collapsed back into the same internal structure without resistance. Even when Olivia Harper was not directly referenced in any report, she remained present in the background of awareness, not as thought, but as continuity, something that did not require attention to remain active. That distinction became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Thought could be interrupted, redirected, replaced, but continuity persisted without permission, and I had never accounted for that variable in any system I built. I stood again in front of the glass overlooking Chicago that night, watching the river reflect fragmented light patterns that shifted without repeating in any exact sequence, and I realized that the contrast between external variability and internal fixation had become the most consistent structure in my perception. I did not feel urgency, nor confusion, nor emotional disruption, because none of those categories applied cleanly to what was occurring. Instead, I recognized a more precise condition forming. My attention was no longer following observation. It was sustaining it. And in that recognition, I understood that the boundary between observer and observed was no longer a function of distance, but a function of persistence, and persistence does not require intent to remain active. I no longer thought in terms of observation beginning or ending, because what had started as a structured process had already become a continuous presence that no longer required initiation, and that realization arrived not as insight, but as accumulation. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always defined control as the ability to separate signal from noise, yet I could no longer distinguish where the signal ended and where the observer began. Olivia Harper continued her life across Chicago with absolute consistency, unchanged in her morning departure at 7:43, unchanged in her route through the city, unchanged in her arrival and return, each movement recorded with precision that should have guaranteed predictability. Yet predictability had ceased to function as clarity. It had become repetition without resolution. I reviewed the surveillance summaries again in my office above the river, the city below moving in structured patterns of light and motion that mirrored nothing of the internal state I was experiencing. Each report confirmed the same sequence, each timestamp aligned with previous entries, yet I continued to process them beyond necessity, not for validation, but for continuity. That distinction had become increasingly important, because validation implies completion, and completion no longer occurred. I instructed my team to maintain passive monitoring at unchanged parameters, no escalation, no deviation, and they confirmed compliance without question, yet even that exchange felt secondary to the larger structure that had already formed. I began to notice that my attention no longer required external prompting. It activated on its own, returning to the same reference point regardless of context, as if the system of observation had internalized its own subject. Olivia Harper remained entirely unaware of this persistent structure surrounding her routine. She continued without alteration, without interruption, without any deviation from the established pattern that had defined her since the beginning. But the meaning of that stability had transformed. It no longer served as data. It served as anchor, and anchors exist only when something is drifting. I attempted to re-establish separation through operational expansion, increasing focus on unrelated matters, extending analysis into areas that previously held priority, but each attempt collapsed back into the same internal reference without resistance or delay. Even when she was not present in direct review, she remained active in the background structure of awareness, not as thought, but as persistence that did not require attention to remain present. That realization marked a point of irreversible clarity. Observation had stopped being an action I performed. It had become a condition that persisted regardless of intent. I stood again in front of the glass overlooking Chicago, watching the river reflect fragmented light that shifted without pattern or repetition, and I recognized that the separation I once depended on had already dissolved in function, even if it still existed in concept. Nothing about Olivia Harper had changed in any measurable way since the first night she entered my awareness. But nothing about my ability to disengage from her pattern had remained intact. And in that final understanding, I recognized that the system had not failed, nor had it been interrupted. It had simply evolved into something that no longer required my permission to continue. I had reached a point where I no longer tried to determine when the shift had occurred, because searching for a beginning implies that there is still a version of the system where nothing has changed, and that possibility no longer aligned with anything I could verify in real time. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always depended on structured separation between observation and interpretation, yet that separation had already dissolved into a single continuous process that no longer required my permission to continue. Olivia Harper remained exactly as she had been from the first recorded moment of observation, consistent in every measurable aspect of her daily life across Chicago, leaving her apartment at 7:43 in the morning, following the same path through the city, boarding the same bus, and returning in the evening with unbroken regularity that never once deviated from the established pattern. That consistency had once represented control within my analytical framework, a stable dataset within a variable environment, but now it no longer functioned as information. It functioned as permanence, something that remained active within my awareness regardless of whether I engaged with it directly. I reviewed the surveillance summaries again in my office above the river, not because new input required evaluation, but because discontinuation itself now felt incomplete, as if removing attention would create a structural gap that the system could not reconcile. The city below continued its predictable motion, lights cycling through intersections, reflections moving across water, yet none of it provided contrast to what had already stabilized internally. I had attempted every rational method of separation, increasing workload, expanding focus, reinforcing external priorities, but each attempt collapsed back into the same reference point without resistance or or delay. That was the moment I understood that nothing external was driving the change. The change existed entirely within the persistence of attention itself. I instructed my team to maintain passive observation at the established level, no escalation, no modification, no interruption, and they confirmed compliance without deviation. Yet even that exchange felt secondary, as if the instruction had already become procedural rather than functional. I noticed that I no longer experienced anticipation as a response to incoming reports. I experienced it as continuity of awareness, as if the system no longer required external validation to remain active. Olivia Harper continued her routine without awareness, unchanged, uninterrupted, moving through her life with the same quiet precision that had always defined her existence. Yet the meaning of that consistency had transformed completely within my perception. It no longer indicated predictability. It indicated persistence of focus that no longer depended on input to sustain itself. I stood in front of the glass, overlooking Chicago once more, observing the river and the distant movement of traffic, and for the first time I did not attempt to separate observation from self-awareness, because the distinction had already ceased to produce any measurable effect. Nothing about her had changed since the beginning. Every recorded detail confirmed that reality without exception. But nothing about my ability to disengage from her pattern had remained intact in any functional sense. And in that final recognition, I understood that what I had been observing was never her life. It was the irreversible reorganization of my own attention around something that had never once asked to be seen. I had stopped searching for the moment where everything changed, because the idea of a single turning point assumes a structure that still respects time as linear cause and effect, and I had already moved beyond that assumption without noticing when it happened. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always believed that observation requires distance, but distance no longer functions as a separator in any meaningful way I can measure. Olivia Harper continued her life across Chicago in absolute consistency, unchanged in her morning departure at 7:43, unchanged in her route through the city, unchanged in her arrival at work and return in the evening. Every recorded detail confirming the same unbroken pattern that had defined her existence from the beginning. That consistency no longer provided analytical clarity. It provided persistence, something that remained active within awareness even when not being reviewed, as if the system no longer required engagement to continue operating. I reviewed the surveillance summaries again in my office above the river, not because new information required validation, but because stopping now felt like an interruption of something that no longer depended on interruption or continuation. The city below maintained its structured rhythm, traffic flowing through intersections, reflections moving across water in steady sequences, yet none of it matched the internal condition that had formed over time without explicit initiation. I had attempted to restore separation through every available method, increasing operational focus, expanding responsibilities, reinforcing boundaries through deliberate disengagement, but each attempt collapsed back into the same internal reference point without resistance, as if all paths of attention eventually converged on a single fixed structure. That was when I understood that nothing external had shifted. The transformation existed entirely within the persistence of attention itself. I instructed my team to continue passive monitoring without escalation, without modification, without deviation, and they confirmed compliance. Yet even that confirmation felt procedural rather than functional, as if the instruction no longer influenced outcome, but only documented continuation. I no longer experienced anticipation as response to incoming data. I experienced it as continuity of awareness, a state that did not depend on updates to remain active. Olivia Harper remained entirely unaware of the structure surrounding her life, continuing without interruption, without variation, moving through the same sequence of actions that had never changed since the beginning. Yet the meaning of that sequence had altered completely within my perception. It no longer functioned as predictability. It functioned as permanence within attention that no longer required reinforcement. I stood in front of the glass, overlooking Chicago once again, observing the river reflect fragmented light that shifted without repeating exact patterns, and I recognized that the distinction between observer and observation had ceased to produce functional separation. Nothing about her had changed since the first recorded moment. Every report confirmed that without exception. But nothing about my ability to disengage from her pattern remained intact in any measurable sense. And in that final recognition, I understood that what I had called observation was never a directed process. It was the silent reorganization of awareness itself around something that had never once required permission to remain. I no longer attempted to determine where the change had begun, because the assumption that change requires a definable origin depends on a stability of perception that I can no longer confirm within any layer of my awareness. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always structured my understanding of systems through separation between observer and observed, yet that separation has dissolved into continuity that no longer responds to reconstruction. Olivia Harper continued her life across Chicago with absolute consistency, unchanged in her departure at 7:43 in the morning, unchanged in her route through the city, unchanged in her arrival at work and return in the evening. Every recorded detail confirming an unbroken sequence that has remained identical since the first moment of observation. That consistency no longer functions as analytical input. It functions as persistence, something that remains active within awareness even when not being reviewed, as if observation itself is no longer required for continuity to exist. I reviewed the surveillance summaries again in my office above the river, not because new information required evaluation, but because discontinuation itself now felt structurally impossible, as if stopping would not create absence, but expose a system that no longer depends on participation to remain active. The city below continued its predictable motion, traffic flowing through intersections, reflections shifting across water in stable repetition, yet none of it aligned with the internal condition that had already formed without identifiable initiation. I had attempted every rational method of separation available, increasing external responsibilities, expanding operational scope, reinforcing boundaries through deliberate disengagement, but each attempt collapsed back into the same internal reference point without resistance, as if all paths of attention had already converged on a single fixed structure that no longer allows deviation. That was the moment I understood that nothing external had altered the system. The transformation existed entirely within the persistence of attention itself. I instructed my team to continue passive monitoring without escalation, without modification, without interruption, and they confirmed compliance. Yet even that confirmation no longer functioned as operational input. It functioned only as documentation of continuity that was already present regardless of instruction. I no longer experienced anticipation as response to incoming data. I experienced it as continuity of awareness, a state that persists without dependency on update or validation. Olivia Harper remained entirely unaware of the structure surrounding her life, continuing without deviation, without interruption, moving through the same sequence of actions that has never once changed since the beginning of observation. Yet the meaning of that sequence has completely transformed within my perception. It no longer represents predictability. It represents permanence within awareness that does not require reinforcement to remain active. I stood once more in front of the glass overlooking Chicago, observing the river reflect fragmented light that shifts without repeating identical patterns, and I recognized that the distinction between observer and observation no longer produces any functional separation. Nothing about her has changed since the first recorded moment. Every report confirms that without exception, but nothing about my ability to disengage from her pattern remains intact in any measurable sense. And in that final recognition, I understood that what I once defined as observation was never directed outward at all. It was the silent reorganization of awareness itself around something that never required permission to remain. I stopped trying to identify when the transition had occurred, because any search for a beginning assumes that time still behaves as a sequence of separable states, and that assumption no longer holds any reliable structure within my perception. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always depended on the separation between observer and subject to maintain control. Yet that separation has dissolved into continuity that no longer requires verification to persist. Olivia Harper continued her life across Chicago with absolute consistency, unchanged in her departure at 7:43 in the morning, unchanged in her route through the city, unchanged in her arrival at work and return in the evening. every recorded detail confirming the same uninterrupted sequence that has defined her existence since the beginning of observation. That consistency no longer functions as analytical input. It functions as permanence, something that remains active within awareness even when not being directly reviewed, as if observation itself is no longer required for continuity to exist. I reviewed the surveillance summaries again in my office above the river, not because new information required interpretation, but because discontinuation now feels structurally impossible, as if stopping would not create absence, but expose that the system no longer depends on participation to continue. The city below continues its predictable rhythm, traffic flowing through intersections, reflections shifting across water in stable repetition. Yet none of it corresponds to the internal condition that has already formed without identifiable initiation. I had attempted every rational method of separation available, increasing external workload, expanding operational scope, reinforcing boundaries through deliberate disengagement, but each attempt collapses back into the same internal reference point without resistance, as if all paths of attention have already converged on a single fixed structure that no longer permits deviation. That was the moment I understood that nothing external had altered the system. The transformation existed entirely within the persistence of attention itself. I instructed my team to continue passive monitoring without escalation, without modification, without interruption, and they confirmed compliance. Yet even that confirmation no longer functions as operational input. It functions only as documentation of continuity that is already present regardless of instruction. I no longer experience anticipation as response to incoming data. I experience it as continuity of awareness, a state that persists without dependency on update or validation. Olivia Harper remains entirely unaware of the structure surrounding her life, continuing without deviation, without interruption, moving through the same sequence of actions that has never once changed since the beginning of observation. Yet the meaning of that sequence has completely transformed within my perception. It no longer represents predictability. It represents permanence within awareness that does not require reinforcement to remain active. I stand once more in front of the glass overlooking Chicago, observing the river reflect fragmented light that shifts without repeating identical patterns, and I recognize that the distinction between observer and observation no longer produces any functional separation. Nothing about her has changed since the first recorded moment. Every report confirms that without exception. But nothing about my ability to disengage from her pattern remains intact in any measurable sense. And in that final recognition, I understand that what I once defined as observation was never directed outward at all. It was the silent reorganization of awareness itself around something that never required permission to remain. I no longer search for a point where observation became something else, because the idea of a beginning depends on a structure of time that I can no longer confirm within my own perception. My name is Mason Grayson, and I have always depended on separation between observer and subject to maintain control, yet that separation has dissolved into continuity that no longer requires validation to persist. Olivia Harper continued her life across Chicago with absolute consistency, unchanged in her departure at 7:43 in the morning, unchanged in her route through the city streets, unchanged in her arrival at work and return in the evening. Every recorded detail confirming the same uninterrupted sequence that has defined her existence since the first moment of observation. That consistency no longer functions as analytical input. It functions as permanence, something that remains active within awareness even when not being directly reviewed, as if observation itself is no longer required for continuity to exist. I reviewed the surveillance summaries again in my office above the river, not because new information required interpretation, but because discontinuation now feels structurally impossible, as if stopping would not create absence, but expose that the system no longer depends on participation to continue. The city below continues its predictable rhythm, traffic flowing through intersections, reflections shifting across water in stable repetition. Yet none of it corresponds to the internal condition that has already formed without identifiable initiation. I had attempted every rational method of separation available, increasing external workload, expanding operational scope, reinforcing boundaries through deliberate disengagement, but each attempt collapses back into the same internal reference point without resistance, as if all paths of attention have already converged on a single fixed structure that no longer permits deviation. That was the moment I understood that nothing external had altered the system. The transformation existed entirely within the persistence of attention itself. I instructed my team to continue passive monitoring without escalation, without modification, without interruption, and they confirmed compliance. Yet even that confirmation no longer functions as operational input. It functions only as documentation of continuity that is already present regardless of instruction. I no longer experience anticipation as response to incoming data. I experience it as continuity of awareness, a state that persists without dependency on update or validation. Olivia Harper remains entirely unaware of the structure surrounding her life, continuing without deviation, without interruption, moving through the same sequence of actions that has never once changed since the beginning of observation. Yet the meaning of that sequence has completely transformed within my perception. It no longer represents predictability. It represents permanence within awareness that does not require reinforcement to remain active. I stand once more in front of the glass overlooking Chicago, observing the river reflect fragmented light that shifts without repeating identical patterns, and I recognize that the distinction between observer and observation no longer produces any functional separation. Nothing about her has changed since the first recorded moment. Every report confirms that without exception. But nothing about my ability to disengage from her pattern remains intact in any measurable sense. And in that final recognition, I understand that what I once defined as observation was never directed outward at all. It was the silent reorganization of awareness itself around something that never required permission to remain.